Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next training in the kindergarten series. This one was going to be about planning arts, crafts, and project lessons and how to plan effective lessons that are focused on measurable input. It's a very important term, measurable input, and we'll be talking a lot about this content. But this training session is a training session which builds upon the content from the training session about teaching practical skills, which was the previous one. So if you haven't watched that, please go and watch that now, and this training will make a lot more sense. So my question to begin this training session is, have you ever spent 20 minutes or maybe 30 minutes or more on preparing a wonderful activity only to realize that students use very little English during that activity? What happened? Why did it happen? And how could the lesson be improved? Have a quick think. Why do you think I'll share about one lesson that I planned, or one activity I planned, sorry. One activity I planned was that I wanted the kids to make animal masks. I spent a lot of time giving the masks out and letting the students choose. We spent a lot of time coloring the masks. Then we spent time sticking the masks on each individual kid. And then when they went outside the classroom, most of them, when they met their parents, they told their parents, hey, look, I've made this beautiful animal mask in Vietnamese, not in English. Now think about a recent project or art lesson, or maybe even STEAM or science lesson. What was the student's final product? What language did students practice and what could they say by the end of the class? Now, when I reflect upon my animal mask activity, I think when I look at this question, something stands out. The thing that stands out is that, okay, we spent the lesson learning animal vocabulary. However, when it came to that final activity, we spent most of the time making the animal mask as opposed to learning to talk about it. So with this lesson in particular, I think the if I have to answer the question, what language students practice and what could they say by the end of the class, is that they couldn't really say anything by the end of the class. They knew the animal vocabulary, but they couldn't say anything. So something we have to consider is, are students learning English or are they simply completing activities? In my situation, my case, they were probably more focused on completing the activities than actually learning English. Okay, compare these two ways of doing a craft. One, students make a beautiful paper butterfly versus students learn language, then create a craft. Step one, we learn the vocabulary, the parts of the butterfly, maybe the colors. Step two is we practice saying it. So it's a butterfly, the butterfly's blue. And step three, the students create a butterfly using that language. Well, which one practices more language and why? I think it's obvious that, method number two practices more language. Why? Because there's different stages, and each stage they're slowly getting more complicated and more involved with the process of speaking language about the butterfly, whereas the first way of doing it is just focused on completing the product. So we can say that one is craft focused and one is process focused. The process focused one is focusing on not only the process of doing, but also the process of learning about it and learning how to talk about it. So a successful lesson is not measured by how nice the final product looks. It's measured by how much language the students can produce about it and how much they can remember. So remember, if they produce something beautiful, but they can't talk about it, it's not a successful lesson. If they produce something which looks a little bit ugly, but they can speak English very well about that product, that's a successful language, because parents know what their children are capable of. So if they spend too much time on creating the product, the parents will know that that's where their lesson time has gone. So some things to avoid. Try to avoid a lot of time cutting and gluing. Try to avoid teacher-led stuff. So this means that when teachers are doing it step by step and students are following step by step. One-time language exposure. So for this means that avoid just letting them hear language they're never going to use again in order to follow the steps to complete the project. This is called one-time language because it's language which is not repeated in other subjects or later on in other lessons. It's a very product, so avoid product-focused lessons. Try to Make sure that there's repeated language process. So if they just practice it one time, that's not enough. Make sure there are lots of speaking opportunities. It may sound silly, but students get better at speaking by speaking. Make sure there's lots of vocabulary recycling. Recycling just means repetition. That either maybe we're repeating vocabulary from other subjects, or we're creating lots of opportunities for vocabulary to be repeated throughout the lesson, or maybe just in that subject from week 1 to week 2 to week 3. Make sure there's purposeful communication. That means that they're not just saying hat, ball, bag, but through the language that they're using, they're describing what they are doing or what they can do. Make sure there's not only a product outcome, the thing that they have to make, but also a language outcome, the thing that they have to say. So I've made a language focused checklist to make it easy for you to know whether your lesson is successful or not successful. So can you clearly state the target vocabulary? If you can clearly state the target vocabulary and it's vocabulary they've learned elsewhere or will use elsewhere, then great. Can you clearly state the target sentence pattern? So can you say very clearly that the target pattern will be I can, I can, I can. Or that's a good thing. Or the bad way of doing it is using 4 or 5 different sentence types. If you use 4 or 5 different sentence types, the students will likely remember how to do it, not remember what it means. Do students say the language multiple times? So do they have multiple times throughout one lesson to practice the language? Do students hear the language multiple times? So not only say it, but they also have to hear it, because in order for output to become output, it must be input first. Will students see this language again next week? So this is the idea about repeating it across the weeks. Does the activity support the language objective? So does the craft activity or the creation of the process support the language outcome? And how does it support the language outcome? So a really great question is that if I remove the craft, so if I basically took the craft or the project out, the actual completion of the product, would language learning still happen? If the answer is yes, it means that you've prepared for them to learn language, and the project or the craft or the experiment is just supporting that language development. Plan backwards. So like you see in the picture, planning your project backwards can actually help it to move forward. So the best thing to do is start with your language goal. What's your language goal? Then what's your vocabulary? Think about the vocabulary that you want your students to learn. Think about your sentence pattern. What are the sentence patterns you're going to use? How are you going to make sure that they're repeated? Think about what opportunities they have to practice these sentence patterns, this vocabulary. How are you going to review and recycle it so it doesn't just happen in this lesson, but it happens across multiple lessons or multiple subjects? And then we get to what is the project, what is the application? Because the project that we have should reflect all of the language that we are using. So 5 questions before you start planning any activity. Like I said before, what's the vocabulary? What's the sentence pattern? How will students practice it? How will it be recycled over many lessons? And what activity or project can help them use it? When will they use it in the project? And what does the final language product look like? If you can answer all of these questions very confidently and clearly, then you can be confident that this lesson, this project lesson, this arts lesson, this science lesson, or whatever lesson, you can be confident that it has a clear language goal. So my general message here is that projects should support language learning, not replace it. So it means that doing the project is a vehicle for learning language and getting to that measurable output of language, not replacing that process. And this is why language needs to be at the center of every lesson. Okay, and in part 2, we're going to talk a little bit about presentations. And this is supporting the idea of how we can make measurable outcomes the language aim. So how do we get students talking for longer? Well, one way of getting students talking for longer is to connect multiple ideas together. So we're not just having them say cat, but it's a cat. And then how can we push it further? So they're not just saying it's a cat, but they're able to say many sentences. So it's a cat, it's a dog, it's a monkey. For that, we need to give them more open-ended practice. And that open-ended practice can be with choice, where they can choose the things to talk about, or it can be with presentations. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this set part 2. One big question is, how do we make sure students can understand what they are saying? So this is what I spoke about with lots of recycled language, lots of recycled sentence patterns. If we use many different sentence patterns, then it's likely the students will be memorizing and repeating instead of actually understanding. Understanding means making our language aims reasonable and appropriate in order for students to be able to produce it. And why should this be something we aim to do in all of our classes? Well, I think we all know that the more students speak, the better they will get at doing it. And the more students can produce, the more that the parents can see it, and the more that the parents can see, okay, the students are clearly making progress. So speaking for longer or presentations is just a vehicle to help achieve this aim. So presentations are routine. So creating presentation routines is one way of doing this. So how could we do it more at the start of the lesson? So what we could do is we could have a small mini presentation as part of the classroom routines. What we could have, we'd start with every day, 2 or 3 students, they come and they stand at the front of the class, and then they have to give a short presentation. That could be a short presentation about themselves where they say, "Hi, my name's Adam. I'm 5 years old. I'm from Vietnam." That's something very simple, and if it becomes a routine, they will understand the content that they have to talk about. And as lessons progress, you can gradually make it more and more complicated, where you're asking the students to do more and more. Another way of doing this is to encourage them with prompts. So for example, instead of just asking one question and waiting for one answer, you could ask 2 questions. So, "Hey Jimmy, how's the weather and how do you feel?" And then we could prompt the response, "No, it's sunny. I'm happy." And that's just one of the building blocks of helping students to be able to answer multiple questions in one longer speaking turn. How about at the end of the lesson? So at the end of the lesson, we could do a student-driven wrap-up. So what does that mean? That means that we present the vocabulary at the front of the class, then we invite maybe 2 or 3 students to come and wrap up the vocabulary. So they could ask questions, for example, "What's this? What's this? What's this?" and point to the different flashcards we have studied or pictures on a PowerPoint. Or they could give the wrap-up themselves. So, "Okay, today we learned red, blue, yellow," and then ask the next student to do the same. The idea being here is that the students are responsible for summarizing the content of the lesson. It helps them to remember it and also helps them to have a longer speaking turn. Next idea is about exit tickets. An exit ticket isn't an actual ticket. It's something that they have to do in order to finish the lesson. So what you could do is have all of the students line up or make 2 lines, and then they have to come to you and they have to say all of the vocabulary or 2 or 3 pieces of the vocabulary, depending on how much time you have and the level of the students, before they can leave the class to go to their break time or go to their next lesson. It's called an exit ticket. This is a great way to get students speaking more and for the teacher to really understand about who understands the lesson and who does not. So building blocks. So this is one way of approaching it. My first idea is, remember, you don't have to always use just one set of flashcards. If you use 2 sets of flashcards or 3 sets of flashcards, so it means that each piece of vocabulary or sentence you're teaching has 3 different cards to represent that sentence. One way of doing that is you could put the students into groups and then call 2 to 4 words. And then students can work in a relay. So the student number 1 gets word number 1, student number 2 gets word number 2, student number 3 gets word number 3. And then they could present them on chairs at the front of the room or just in order on the floor. Afterwards, then we can encourage students to repeat the words and then to make them into sentences and then to join the sentences together. So for example, if it's red, blue, yellow, I'll have them repeating red, blue, yellow. Then I'll have them repeating it's red, it's green, it's yellow. And then I'll have them doing it independently, not following me, but as a group saying it's red, it's blue, it's yellow. That way, instead of just saying one word or one sentence, they're saying 3 sentences in a row. Another idea is that the goal is communication. So what we should do when we are teaching language, we should also present the question. Why do we do that? Because we do that so that when it comes to actual speaking practice, they have the question ready in order to use it in that spoken practice. What would that look like? So let's say I'm teaching colors. I would say, what color is it? It's red. What color is it? It's blue. By presenting it like this in the presentation phase, then when they get to the control practice or the less control practice, the question will be ready in their heads. It will be familiar, so they'll more easily be able to use it, and that promotes communication. Wherever possible, give choice. So for example, like I mentioned earlier, is that you can give open questions. Open questions means, so for example, you can show them a picture. And the picture can be many animals. So you could just say, what do you see? And then all of the students will see different things and name different things. By doing this, they're actually making a choice and they're demonstrating that they understand what they are saying. Another idea is I don't like circles. So for example, if you're studying about colors or foods or sports, you can have one circle I like, one circle I don't like. Then you could play a game where the students have to run to find the flashcard, and then they have to sort it in the correct circle, whether they like it or they don't like it. And they could say a follow-up sentence, I like yellow, I don't like yellow, based on what they actually think, what they actually believe. This way, they're actually engaging with the meaning, not just engaging with the repetition. Another idea is 2 lines. You get them to make 2 lines, then you could present flashcards on the floor or pictures on the TV, and then you could have student A pick what word, what picture do they want to ask student B about. And the question can be simple, like what's this, or do you like, and then student A makes a choice, then student B asks student A, again making a choice. Choice is very, very important in kindergarten. So to summarize, remember, every lesson, even lessons focused on skills, arts, or projects, are still language lessons. Language lessons need to have a very clear, measurable outcome. Break it into small pieces, make sure there's lots of repetition, recycling, and keep your target language output in mind when you're planning each stage. I believe if you do all of this, you will have a wonderful language lesson. Doesn't matter whether it's practical skills, arts, science, project, you will make sure that the key focus is always language. All right, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.